welcome back. I'm going to record this chapter as bacteria all in one big recording. So again, feel free to stop, to pause, to resume whenever you want. It's a little bit shorter of a unit, or a little bit shorter of a PowerPoint than the gram-positive and the gram-negative bacteria. It's our unusual bacteria chapter. Now, they're all unusual because they might have an unusual shape, but they might have an unusual behavior, or some unusual feature about them. So they get grouped in just our unusual bacteria. A little bit shorter of a PowerPoint, so again, just going to record it as one big, huge recording. So feel free to stop, feel free to pause me whenever you want. Now, our unusual bacteria are Rickettsias, Chlamydias, our Spirochetes, and our Vibrios. We group them into those four particular groups. Again, they are grouped based on size, they're grouped based on shape, they're grouped based on a unique feature about them. So our first group, the Rickettsias group, we're going to talk about some of the top Rickettsias that are found in there. We're going to talk about the Chlamydias group, and again, there's not just one chlamydia out there. Everyone thinks chlamydia, and they think the sexually transmitted disease. It's not the only chlamydia out there. We're going to talk about the spirochete-shaped group and talk about a couple of our top spirochetes that cause human disease, and we're going to talk about the Vibrio group and why they're called that. So our first group, the Rickettsia group, and we're going to talk about three bacteria that fit into the Ricketsia group. The first has the genus name Ricketsia, but it's not the only Ricketsia one out there. Ehrlichia and Anaplasma are also two common Ricketsias that cause human disease. They are grouped into this group because they're extremely small, so part of it's their size. They also appear wall-less. They have very little peptidoglycan. So that's kind of one of their unique characteristics. They are all spread by ticks, and they are all obligate intracellular parasites. So we can actually see this cell is infected with this particular bacteria. And I should note, anything in chapter 21, all of their unique shape, their unique behaviors, whatever it is, they are all gram-negative bacteria. So lots of gram-negatives that affect humans. But they are intracellular parasites, and they're obligate intracellular parasites. They do have all of the DNA to be able to do their own protein synthesis, make ATP. They could do everything on their own, but they actually prefer to live in and feed off of their hosts. So they could live on their own genetic-wise, but instead they become parasites and live off their host. Now, our first Ricketsia group is a Ricketsia bacteria. So its genus is Ricketsia, and the species is Rickettsiae. So it's Rickettsiae. And this particular bacteria, causes the disease Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Now, it's called that because it was commonly found out west from here in the Rocky Mountains. It is spread by ticks, hard ticks specifically. One of the ticks that can cause it or spread it is called the Rocky Mountain wood tick. It is not the only tick, though, and it's not only found in the Rocky Mountains. It just gets that name. A couple other ticks that can spread it is one is called the American dog tick. There's some other brown dog ticks, cayenne ticks, lots of various types of ticks, but they are all a type of hard tick. So if you looked at the grouping of ticks, there's a whole group of hard ticks. Now, this particular bacteria, again, it is an intracellular parasite. It specifically likes to feed and get into the cells that line our blood vessels. Now I'm going to flip back. So this is showing some of our capillaries. These are our blood vessels themselves, just sliced sideways through it. And all of the red is the actual bacteria. So the bacteria like to get into the cells that line our blood vessel walls. Now, as they become parasites in these cells, they eventually destroy the cells. They start to destroy the tissues of the blood vessel walls. And as the blood vessel walls start to die and break apart, it leads to hemorrhaging. And that's when we start to see the spotting occurring on the skin. This little red spots, that is broken blood vessel lining, or broken blood vessel walls, and we now see that blood that's getting released. So it looks like a rash that is just because of the broken blood vessel walls. Usually appears mostly on your appendages, on the trunk first. And that's where we get the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That's the spotted part. So yes, you are under attack, so you're going to have a fever. It's your body's immune system response. It gets where it gets its name. You know, our top cases, but there are cases here in Wisconsin. Generally, I would say up until last year, we really haven't had any. But not that long ago, we here in La Crosse had our very first case of Rocky Mountain spotted fever. This happened not last summer, but the summer before that. Again, very rare to have it here in La Crosse. Most people that picked up the bacteria were those that traveled south and slightly west of here based on the map. But it is around the area. So our first case, someone had picked it up in La Crosse County. They picked it up here. They actually died because of it. And again, it's not very commonly found around here, so it had gone undiagnosed for a significant amount of time. That even once finally diagnosed, it was too late. And so we did have our first death because of it. So it's around. Again, very rare. Treatable. We do, doxycycline's our top antibiotic that treats, but it can be a deadly bacteria. It gets into the blood vessel walls. Now, a couple other bacteria that are in the Rickettsias group, it just doesn't get the Rickettsia genus name, is Ehrlichia and Anaplasma. Again, both intracellular parasites, both spread by ticks, and they are both two emerging diseases in the United States. So the Ehrlichia schaffiensis is the top Ehrlichia that causes human disease, and Anaplasma phagocytophilum is our top Anaplasma that causes disease. Now, this one even tells you the name that it likes, that's the fill, to be eaten. It's an intracellular parasite, so it wants to be eaten by phagocytes, and then it stays inside of them and causes disease. And so these are two emerging diseases. We're starting to get symptoms or cases more and more here, even local. So my little note on cases, anything that's in purple means we have both Ehrlichia and Anaplasma here, and we do have cases of both of them here in Wisconsin. They both kind of behave the same. They're both spread by ticks, including the deer tick as well as other ticks in the area. The anaplasmosis is the second most reported tick disease in Wisconsin, followed by Lyme's disease, which we're going to get to in this PowerPoint. Both of them can be deadly, both even if left untreated. They are both treated by antibiotics. If left untreated, it can kill between 5 and 10% of those that are infected. They don't get a rash like the Rickettsia. Mostly it's an extreme fever. So again, it is killing cells depending on where the bacteria goes, and if left untreated, it could cause death, usually more in immunocompromised patients, elderly, infants, but we have it here. This is just to show you, this is the 2007 map of Ehrlichia and Anaplasma. Again, the farther north you go, the more cases there are. And I'm like, but it is around the area. We have cases every year of these two particular bacteria. Now, if this bacteria gets in the body, it does have 3 developmental stages in your white blood cells. Again, it likes to be eaten by phagocytes, and then the bacteria will hang out inside those phagocytes. So when it first gets in the body, or first in the cell, it's called an elementary body. So it's inside there. It gets enveloped in a phagosome, this little vessel from these phagocytes. It gets rid of the phagosome, doesn't need it because it doesn't get broken down. It's developed a way to not get broken down by our phagocytes, and then it starts to reproduce. That's when we call it an initial body. Now, as it starts to reproduce, it is more susceptible to getting broken down, but it can still survive it. To make it more protective, it does develop its own vesicle around itself where it continues to reproduce. That's when we call it a morula. That's when it can start to become more visible, as in this picture. And then those bacteria are released. Again, they are small. They are gram-negative, and because they are really small, they can sometimes appear round. So again, they are pleomorphic, but occasionally they do look like gram-negative cocci. But because they don't keep their original shape, they are not considered a specific gram-negative cocci shape. Now, I was going to say, my little note on there, I'm like, treated. Again, we do have antibiotics that can treat it. The sooner you can get treated, the better. Best prevention, because they are spread by ticks, avoid getting bitten by ticks. I'm like, wear your bug spray in the summer. Make sure you've got socks on top of your pant legs. I know it's not stylish, but that allows the ticks or prevents the ticks from climbing up your legs. It's tick season already. Pretty much we have tick season as soon as the last snow or some of the snow starts to melt. Ticks come out, and they come out all the way until the snow lands again. So it's anything to get avoiding or just avoid getting bitten by ticks is the best prevention. Now, our second of the 4 groups we're going to talk about is the chlamydia group. They are again grouped together because of their size. They are extremely small, and they actually have no cell wall whatsoever. They still have 2 cell membranes. They are still a gram-negative bacteria, but they have no cell wall whatsoever, which means their shape can change a little bit. But they're extremely tiny, so they're usually going to show up more as a round shape, but the shape can still change. They are also parasites. However, they are specifically parasites of ATP. They cannot make their own ATP. So a lot of times their nickname is the energy parasite group. There are 2 forms that chlamydias can be found in. One is called the elementary body. It's the smaller form. This is the infective form that can remain dormant. It can survive outside of the cells. It can survive on surfaces for short periods of time. So it is the infective form that you would pick up. Once it gets inside of cells, again, it's intracellular, and it starts to reproduce inside the cell, that's when we call it the reticulate body. It's going to be larger, it's going to be reproducing. This is not the infective form because this is the form that it's reproducing inside of our cells. Now, this is just to show the different stages that, yes, once it gets inside of our cells, stealing all of our ATP as the elementary body, when it starts to reproduce, now it's called the reticulate body. So it converts into that reticulate dividing body within about 10 hours of getting inside the cell. Reproduces like crazy. Again, this is all within 24 hours. Makes lots and lots of new cells. They get released and go infect another cell. So it reproduces very, very quickly. Now, there are 3 types of chlamydia, or 3 main species of chlamydia that infect humans. The most common, the most commonly heard of, is Chlamydia trachomatis, or trachomatis. And it enters the body with some kind of opening, so an abrasion, a laceration, but it can also cross various mucous membranes, including the eyes, around the nose, in the reproductive tract. It is the most common or number 1 reportable STD in the United States. There are about 1.5 million cases every single year in the United States. All the symptoms of Chlamydia trachomatis are all because this bacteria gets into those cells. It will eventually kill the cells. It can cause inflammation, but because it can get into the conjunctiva of the eyes, it also causes a lot of eye infections every year. Again, we touch the eyes, it can get in there, and when we touch our eyes with our hands, anytime we touch various instruments, any IM instruments that touch the eyes, flies that get in and around the eyes can transmit this particular bacteria. Now, depending on how you pick it up, and there's a lot of chlamydia pictures when I Googled them, depending on how you pick it up, sexually transmitted or in the eyes, kind of depends on which disease you have. If it's the sexually transmitted disease, it can cause lots of different types of symptoms or disorders. One's called non-gonococcal urethritis, which means it's inflammation of the urethra that's not caused by a coxal-shaped bacteria, and it's not caused by the gonorrhea, that's its own separate bacteria. But non-gonococcal urethritis is inflammation of the urethra, which the main symptom is going to be painful urination. It can cause inflammation of the reproductive tract. It is spread through sexual intercourse. It can cause inflammation of the vagina. It can cause inflammation of the urethra. It can cause pelvic inflammatory disease. It can cause swollen lymph nodes, as shown on this picture on the right. It can cause that proctitis. Again, that's all inflammation of your lymph nodes. It's inflammation of the reproductive tract. It can cause lots of different disorders. Again, it's all spread through sexual intercourse. Just depends on where the inflammation occurs. When it's picked up, depends on kind of which disorder you end up with. Now, again, because it can get in through the conjunctiva of the eye when touching the eye, it can cause what's known as trachoma, which is the disease of the eye. It's an ocular disease. Now, this bacteria can cause inflammation in and around the eyes. It can get picked up during childbirth because if the mom has it in the reproductive tract, baby can pick it up during childbirth. This bacteria, when it gets in there and causes infection, can actually cause the eyelid to turn inward, as shown on this picture, which can cause damage to the cornea. Now, if it damages the cornea enough, it can cause non-traumatic blindness, which just means blindness caused by a non-traumatic event, like getting poked in the eye with a stick. So this is a bacteria that after childbirth, infants are given antibiotics in their eyes right after childbirth to prevent this, to prevent a lot of other bacterial infections that can occur during childbirth, because picking up various bacteria from mom. Now, to diagnose for this particular bacteria, they can look at the bacteria, they can do various type of staining procedure, they can do what's known as a fluorescent antibody stain, as shown on here. They're just going to fluoresce the antibodies that are going to stick to it. They can do different types of molecular testing, they can look for the DNA of the bacteria. It is treatable. The top antibiotic they give is erythromycin. If there's an eye infection, they might have to surgically correct the eyelid to prevent blindness. Best prevention, abstinence, monogamy. Condoms help, but they are not 100% effective, but they help. Now, again, there's more than one chlamydia. Everyone's like, they hear the word chlamydia and they immediately think the sexually transmitted bacteria, which is the top cause, or the top bacteria for causing human diseases. But there's other chlamydias. One's called Chlamydia pneumoniae. It causes about 10% of all pneumonia cases out there, but it can also cause about 5% of bronchitis and sinus infections. So yes, you could have a sinus infection caused by a chlamydia bacteria. Just a different chlamydia. It's Chlamydia pneumoniae. Normally the symptoms of it are pretty mild though. It's normally tired, a chronic cough that doesn't seem to want to go away. It's not generally a deadly bacteria. It's more of just, a mild disease bacteria. Another chlamydia bacteria is what's known as Chlamydia psittaci. It is spread from birds. So it's an ornithotic disease because that means it comes from birds, and it causes flu-like symptoms. So tired, fatigue, fever. It's generally picked up for those that handle animals, infected animals, specifically birds. It's spread via aerosols or contact with an infected pet or infected material. So if someone, people have a lot of contact with birds or around a lot of birds, around a lot of bird material, it's at higher risk. Again, mild flu-like symptoms. Our third group of our unusual bacteria are the spirochetes. These are the ones we're not working with any of them in our lab, which I'm totally okay with because of the diseases that they can cause. But they all have this helical shape to it, kind of this little corkscrew look to it, and they actually move in a corkscrew fashion. They can burrow through tissue using a corkscrew fashion movement. Now, there are top two genus of bacteria that cause human disease. They're not the only two that are spirochetes, but there are the top two that we're going to talk about that cause human disease, the Treponema and the Borrelia. The first one, the Treponema, the most common Treponema that causes human disease is Treponema pallidum. It gets two pallidums. Sometimes we just shorten the one pallidum, but it gets two pallidums in its name. And the disease that Treponema pallidum causes is syphilis. Humans are the only organisms that can be infected or can develop syphilis, and if we pick up this particular bacteria, it does progress, if left untreated, through 3 phases of syphilis. Now, it is, usually, but not always, a sexually transmitted bacteria, but it can be spread if you have contact with any open wound and the bacteria gets in the body. Now, the first phase that it progresses through is known as primary syphilis, and usually the symptoms, you're going to get canker stores at the infection site, and so you're going to usually get reddened lesions, the canker sores at the infection site. If again left untreated, the bacteria can spread throughout the body and develop into what's known as secondary syphilis, as in the second picture, is where you get a full body rash. That usually takes about a month and a half, 6 to 8 weeks, until you develop in it. Again, the bacteria are in the bloodstream. Now, other than the body rash, it's usually, you've got a full bacteria infection, you're usually going to have a fever, you're going to be tired, you're going to have muscle pain, and that rash can last for months. They generally say it's not itchy, even though it looks like it would be itchy. It's just the bacteria spreading an infection around through the bloodstream. Now, this is normally where I would put a little line on the board, because although you can have this body rash and fever, tired muscle aches for months, most individuals, especially if healthy immune system, can eventually get rid of the bacteria. And so you go into kind of this intermediate phase called a latency phase, where the bacteria is now gone from the body. Your immune system got rid of the bacteria itself. And for years, if not decades, no symptoms whatsoever. The bacteria is gone. However, later on in life, years later, decades later, you can develop what's known as tertiary syphilis. This is because as that bacteria was in the body, it was damaging the body. It was damaging tissue. And it was in the bloodstream and it went everywhere. And later on in life, you can actually develop symptoms later because of the damage that was done during that active infection. So the bacteria is not there. It was gone years, if not decades ago. However, damage was done to tissue. And so we normally start to see some various central nervous system issues. We can start to see heart problems. It can develop into blindness. It can develop in paralysis. And all of a sudden, like, the skin can develop issues. Gumas, these rubbery lesions can happen on the skin. It can happen in the bone. It's all because of just various tissue that was done to the nervous system, the heart. At that point, we run into the issue is, how do you diagnose it? It has to go based on symptoms. It has to go based on past medical history, because the bacteria itself is not present. So you can't test for the bacteria. You just have to look at symptoms and past medical history. Now, again, it is generally spread through sexual contact, and so the top populations are generally those prostitutes, those in the sex trades, those that are users of illegal drugs, because although it can be spread through sexual contact, it can be spread through sharing needles. It is a bacteria that can cross the placenta. Again, not a lot of bacteria that can. It can cause a lot of malformations, cognitive disabilities in infants, and serious effects on infants. Now, healthcare workers can also pick it up if they have any contact with lesions in any infected patients. And so, again, need to have that PPE on. You don't know what your patients have and what they can transmit to you. Now, the incidence of syphilis, I was going to say, in general, the cases have gone way down. And we know it. Condoms do help. We've been promoting it. However, there does seem to be an increase in the number of cases just in the last 10, 15 years. Mostly is because of increase in drug use and shared needles. That's causing the number of cases. Can't blame anti-vaxxers for this because we don't have a vaccine for it. Now, to diagnose, they look at blood supply. Again, it can get into the blood, and they look for what's known as a rapid plasminogen. They're going to screen the blood. They're going to look for the bacteria itself. It's a unique shape. It has that spirochete look to it. They can do various fluorescent antibody tests and try to look for the bacteria. Tertiary syphilis, though, that again, because the bacteria is not present, they just have to look for what are your current symptoms and what's your past medical history. Have you had this bacteria? Did it go undiagnosed for a long period of time? Treatment, penicillin is the treatment of choice. It is the antibiotic they were always going to go for. It is the most effective antibiotic for this particular bacteria. Even those that are allergic to antibiotics, they actually do start to try to desensitize them to it by giving smaller doses, because it's that effective of an antibiotic. Prevention, abstinence, because it is mostly spread by sexual intercourse, abstinence, monogamy, condoms. Obviously, if it's spread through drug use, don't share needles, proper PPE, things like that. Our next spirochete is Borrelia. It's very skinny, very thin, so it doesn't pick up stain very well. Now everyone's like, oh, I don't know what if any Borrelia bacteria. You absolutely do, and especially around here, because Borrelia burgdorferi is the bacteria that causes Lyme's disease, and we absolutely have that around here. So it is a Borrelia, it is a spirochete bacteria. It's spread by ticks of the Ixodes genus, so deer tick fit into that group. Now, understanding the tick life cycle can help you understand how the bacteria is spread and picked up. So we're going to start with the tick lays eggs. Eggs always start as uninfected. In the spring, they hatch as a larva, and they're going to be hungry. So they're going to feed off some small animal, and that's where they pick up the bacteria. Small animals contain or harbor the bacteria. Now, as that larva grows, the bacteria multiply as we go through summer, as we go into fall, and as we go into winter. So as that larva continues to grow, the bacteria continue to reproduce. And larvae are extremely tiny, and they can feed off of you, they can bite you, and they can infect you. Larvae look almost like a grain of sand. So that's extremely hard to find, especially if it gets into the hair. And so again, they can infect you as larvae. Now, as they go through winter, they hibernate, and as they come out of winter into spring, they develop into nymph. Still extremely tiny, but as they were hanging out, bacteria was still reproducing, and come spring, they are hungry. So the nymph can bite you and infect you as it tries to feed. And as they go into that second year, that is when they develop into adults. Again, they're hungry, and that bacteria has been reproducing this entire time. So if you get bitten by a larva in the first year when it's the tiniest, you can pick it up. But it's rare. They're still really tiny. They're really looking for smaller things to feed off of. But that second year, when they develop into those adult ticks and as a nymph, again, as they feed on you, especially spring when they are coming out of hibernation, they are hungry, and those bacteria have been reproducing the entire year. So I'm like, just, keep a watch out for it, especially in the spring. And I'm like, lots of places or lots of times they can infect you. Now, they are called deer ticks because they do, as adults, prefer to feed off of larger animals like deer, and it is where they can pick up the bacteria if they haven't picked it up beforehand. Now, again, as they're adults, that is when they lay eggs, but eggs start off with nothing, but then the whole process starts all over again. Now, the signs and symptoms of Lyme's disease vary. Everyone's like, well, but if you get the bullseye's rash. Yes, but 30% of individuals don't get the bullseye's rash. And what if you had a bullseye's rash on your head? On your, underneath your hair? You wouldn't even see it. Now, other signs and symptoms of Lyme's disease. And again, it's a huge variety. It depends on the individual. A lot of times tired, dizzy, stiff, because the bacteria readily does like to cause inflammation and issues with joints. It can cause headaches, night sweats, inability to concentrate. Some have said they have a sensitivity to light. Some become irritable. Lots of things that can cause that, though. And even ear ringing, a tinnitus. So I'm like, lots of variety of signs and symptoms, which again, sometimes can go undiagnosed then for long periods of times. Depending on your signs and symptoms, it could, show as some other type of disorder. So as you get bitten by a tick, it generally goes through 3 phases if untreated. Usually some type of localized phase, getting a rash, giving inflammation. Again, if left untreated, it can, but only about 10% of individuals develop into what's known as an early disseminated stage, where it can affect your neurological symptoms. It can cause meningitis. It can cause inflammation of the heart and causing heart issues. Rare that it gets to that. Most people have some type of localized issue, localized inflammation, some, the tired, the dizzy, the headaches, the inflammation of various joints. However, it can, because of joint tissue damage, when you have the infection, if left untreated for long periods of time, can develop into what's known as a late disseminated stage, where you can have severe arthritis that can last for years. Now, the number of cases of Lyme's disease is increasing. Not because of anti-vaxxers, we don't have a vaccine for it yet, for humans, we do for animals. It's mostly because we are building out into the environment where the ticks are. And as we go out where the ticks and the deer are, the number of cases of Lyme's disease is going up. Now, diagnosing, we, try to look for signs and symptoms, a bullseye's rash, the tired, the fatigue, things like that. Otherwise, the Western blot, where you're looking for 5 out of the 10 main antigens for this particular bacteria to make a confirmative diagnosis. Treatment, we do have antibiotics that work, but the earlier you can get treated, the better off you are, because this is a bacteria that can cause lots of damage when you have an infection that can cause long-lasting issues later on. So the earlier you can get treated, the better. Now, best prevention, because it's spread by ticks, specifically deer ticks, is avoid getting bitten by ticks. Using different types of insect spray, anything that's got that DEET in it, making sure the socks are on top of the pants, wearing light colored clothing so if you can more readily see a tick before it bites you. And yes, based on our map right there, we have a lot of cases of Lyme's disease around here. I found this one. This was the most updated one from the Wisconsin Public Health. Lots of cases around here, and the cases just keep going up. This is just showing Wisconsin, Minnesota, really high risk for this particular bacteria. Yay, us. On our last group of our unusual bacteria, and our last group of just bacteria in general, is the Vibrio group. Now, they're called this because, when we gram stain them, they're all gram negative. Everything in this chapter is, but they do have a slight curve to them. And when we put them in water, because they are found in watery environments, they vibrate in the water because they have a flagella and they have that curve to it, so they vibrate. They have kind of a vibrating look to in the water. That's why they got their name. So usually found in watery environments, usually salt water, but they can tolerate fresh water. And one that can tolerate fresh water that is the most likely to cause disease is called Vibrio cholerae. Causes the disease known as cholera. We pick it up by ingesting contaminated food or water that has this particular bacteria in it. And our body temperature, that 37 degrees Celsius, activates this bacteria to do its job. Now, again, like a lot of bacteria we've talked about, it's not the bacteria that causes all the issues, it's the toxin that the bacteria makes that causes all the issue. And this is no exception to that. It makes a toxin called the cholera toxin that causes massive fluid and electrolyte loss, which makes it very deadly bacteria because of that fluid and electrolyte loss. Now, the diarrhea that it causes with the fluid and electrolyte loss, by the time you flush out everything that you've eaten in the last how many days, the fluid that comes out of you has what's called as a rice water stool-like appearance. So although this looks like fluid, this is the diarrhea. So if you've ever made rice, noodles too, you're going to think of this next time you do it. And I'm like, the water that you would pour off has that white cloudy appearance. Well, this particular bacteria causes the diarrhea to have that white cloudy appearance. That's the massive fluid and electrolyte. It's those electrolytes that are in there that give it that white cloudy appearance. Now, how it does that. When you ingest something that has this particular bacteria in it, the bacteria produces a toxin. The toxin binds to the cells of our small intestine. There's your microvilli. As part of the toxin gets into the cells of the small intestine lining, it makes something called cyclic AMP. I'm not too particular about all of these intermediate enzymes. However, this particular thing called cyclic AMP, we shorten it and call it CAMP, it tells the cells of our small intestine to secrete the chloride ion, the sodium ion, as well as other electrolytes. So they're going to secrete them out into the intestine itself, the lumen of the intestine. Now, anywhere electrolytes go, water always follows. It's osmosis. Wherever the electrolytes goes, water always follows. This is what causes massive fluid and electrolyte loss. It's this toxin that causes the cells to secrete the electrolytes, and water follows to the point that we can lose a liter of fluid and electrolyte an hour. I mean, That's massive. If you can't replace a liter an hour back into the body of both fluid and electrolytes, it's what causes the death of so many individuals. Now, lucky for us, can't survive freezing, so yay with winter, that it can't be found in watery environments where it freezes over. And so it is generally found in more tropical areas. Most of the cases are found both in South and Central America, but we kind of seem to have almost like waves of this bacteria spreading. Now, diagnosing it, well, one, you're going to look at the diarrhea. It has that rice water appearance to it. But treatment is mostly fluids and electrolytes. If we try to give some type of antimicrobial drug, it's usually lost in the stool with that massive fluid and electrolyte loss. That sometimes they'll try to do a really strong doxycycline antibiotic if it's really bad. But again, because you have to do such a strong antibiotic, because so much of it is lost in the diarrhea, it can have a lot of side effects. So it's, kind of trying to see what can you treat with that's not going to cause more damage than the bacteria itself. Proper prevention is proper sewage and water treatment so you don't ingest this particular bacteria. And we do have a oral vaccine for areas that do suffer or have more cases of this particular bacteria. It only lasts or activates our immune system for about 2 years, so it gives short-term protection. So if you're traveling somewhere, you could take it. But, Mike, it's not a long-lasting vaccine for those that live in endemic areas. Our next Vibrio group, because of the shape, it does have a slightly curved shape to it. It's almost helical, but not quite, not long enough that it gives a full spiral shape to it. So it's in our Vibrio group. Is Campylobacter jejuni. So I like this. He looks like he's camping. It is the most common cause of gastroenteritis in the United States, meaning it's going to cause food poisoning. Now, growing it does require a very specialized media. It's kind of picky, and it actually grows best at 42 degrees Celsius. It'll still grow in our body, but it actually grows best if we make it a little warmer. It's found in a lot of animals. It's found in, your dogs, your cats. It's found in farm animals like chickens and cows. And we pick it up by ingesting contaminated food, milk, or water. Poultry is the top contaminant, just like salmonella. And I'm like, so, we always think of salmonella when we think of chicken, but we should also be thinking of Campylobacter when we're thinking of chicken. Now, it does cause diarrhea. Difference, though, between this diarrhea and salmonella diarrhea is Campylobacter causes bloody and frequent diarrhea. It's usually 7 to 10 days of bloody, frequent diarrhea. You're generally going to be in the hospital if you're going to have a Campylobacter infection. Now, proper prevention, proper food prep and handling, making sure stuff is cleaned properly, cooked properly. You don't have, contaminated surfaces touching uncontaminated surfaces, and we can avoid it. And then our last bacteria is Helicobacter pylori. Now, it has a slightly helical shape, and so it doesn't get a full helix, it doesn't get a full spirochete. It's still in the Vibrio group. It still has a flagella, which helps it vibrate. But based on its name, it tells you a little bit about the shape, but it also tells you where you find it. Pylori is because it's found in the stomach, like the pylorus region of the stomach. And so this is a bacteria that can survive that really low pH of our stomach. And it can grow in our stomach and cause issues in our stomach. Now, this bacteria is usually picked up by eating contaminated food, drinking contaminated water like well water, or touching inanimate objects that are contaminated with the bacteria. A fomite is a contaminated object, inanimate object, like clothing, bedding, doorknobs, things like that. And as this bacteria colonizes the cells that line our stomach, it causes inflammation of the stomach and stomach ulcers. This is the bacteria that causes the most stomach ulcers. Most people thought stress caused ulcers. It doesn't, but it can aggravate ulcers. However, there are various types of drugs that can cause ulcers too, but this is the bacteria that causes the most ulcers. Now, its big virulence factors It does have proteins that inhibit stomach acid, so it's not like it likes acid, but it's figured out a way to live with the acid. So it inhibits our stomach from making as much acid. It has flagella, so it can burrow through the stomach lining easier. It has adhesion proteins to help it stick to the cells that line our stomach acid. And it has enzymes that neutralize our stomach acid. So if you ate something that has this bacteria, it's got the flagella, burrows through the layer of mucus that lines our stomach. Now, we have a layer of mucus that lines our stomach wall to protect our stomach from that extreme acid, that's the green, the extreme stomach acid that's in our stomach. If we didn't have this layer of mucus, we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have that protection, and the acid would actually destroy our stomach wall. So this bacteria neutralizes the acid. It's hanging out in it. It burrows through that layer of mucus. It sticks to the cells that line our stomach wall, and then it thins that layer, that protective layer of mucus. And because it thins that protective layer of mucus, that acid found in our stomach wall will start to digest away and destroy our stomach lining. That's an ulcer. Now, if it destroys enough of the wall of our stomach, not only do you have an ulcer, but it could get to blood vessels and you now have a bleeding ulcer. So this bacteria, because it's thinning that protective mucus, causes ulcers. Now, to diagnose for it, one, they're going to look for symptoms, the pain in the stomach, especially after eating when you have an increased acid production. They also do a lab test that's called the urease test, and it's definitely very bright pink. And so it always has a positive urease test. Now, it is treatable. We always give antibacterial drugs to try to kill the bacteria. We also usually take drugs to inhibit acid production so that our stomach has the protection there from the acid to try to rebuild itself, and it can. Prevention, good hygiene so you don't get the bacteria, you're not touching surfaces and then ingesting the bacteria. Adequate sewage treatment, proper food handling and prep so that you're just not ingesting the bacteria. So there's some more bacteria to go with. Now, since we finished this, you can go ahead and take the next quiz on unusual bacteria. Unusual bacteria.